Welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
Hi, I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
And this is our show where every episode we talk about something in arts and entertainment. It's a relatively unrehearsed conversation. We're never entirely sure where we're going to go. If you like our show, if you don't like our show, if you want us to mention your name out loud on the show, all you have to do is leave a comment in the comment section. And if you really cannot, you just don't want to miss the next episode, please like and subscribe. We're available. Randall, what are the various things we're available on?
Check our website, chrisandrandall.com, because there's all sorts of ways to listen to our show and subscribe. You can leave a comment there. You can go to our Facebook page. There's a link to our Facebook page on there. You can leave a comment on our Facebook page. I mean, just check it out.
Yeah, and I really think this is a good episode for you to give your 2 cents in, I'm hoping, because I know a number of my friends who are parents, who are teachers, who read books. You guys are going to have some pretty strong opinions about the next this particular episode and what we discuss. Because Randall, you made the suggestion today that what is our topic?
We are going to discuss the genre of young adult fiction.
YA fiction. Now, full disclosure, when you proposed this to me, I was a little bit concerned because up until now, every episode, I've really been discussing things with you that I felt like I was an aficionado of, something I loved, something I felt like an expert in. And I don't really feel like an aficionado or an expert in contemporary YA fiction or in YA fiction in general. But in preparing for this show, I realized, well, I once was a child. I once was a young adult. I read books, both for fun, and I read books in school. And I think it's impossible to grow up in North America in the 20th century, or much less the 21st, and not have encountered young adult fiction. So on some level, I guess everyone is, and we've all been young adults, so I'm an expert. We're an expert in our own experiences. And I do think YA fiction today, wouldn't you say, it's become a dominant part of the fiction market. So what do we mean when we use the term YA fiction, and how did it come to be? So technically the word YA fiction, when I looked it up, is all fiction where the protagonist is between the ages of 12 and 18, essentially from early adolescence to the beginning of adulthood. Now, as a genre, I was able to find out that stories about children has been around at least since the late 19th century, actually the late 18th century, my apologies. And the concept even of childhood is what would you say? I think that's also an 18th century concept.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like you go back to the era of when Little Women was written, and there was a lot of discussion about educating children. Like Louisa May Alcott, the writer of Little Women, her father. I'm getting this from. Okay, I won't say where I get this from.
He was a big educator.
He was big into the education movement. Most of the things we think of in modern education came from that era. The idea of not paddling children until they sat still and and just regurgitated facts. I mean, that's how education used to be. And so Louisa May Alcott was educated by this man who wanted to turn little kids into little geniuses, and she had a huge advantage in life. And so those people of the era, they wanted to create childhood. They wanted to create this special space where people would develop their minds to the fullest.
And you have in that period of history, I mean, in an industrial revolution, children now, you have the emergence of a middle class. Not every child now has to go and work in a factory. Children are working in factories, and many children do not have the privilege to have childhoods. But those who do are now going to schools, and they're now having their experience as children being recognized in works like Little Women, even in popular fiction of the time, such as Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn or Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. at this point, Alice in Wonderland. You have, starting a little bit before even mid-19th century, into the early part of the 19th century, a beginning of a canon of works about the experience of youth and the concept of a child and the child's experience as a protagonist, right, Randall? That they're capable of actually going on adventures without an adult.
Right. Well, they outlawed child labor, and now kids got to do something.
Well, but you have even in like things like Charles Dickens in Great Expectations, where the child working, the child dealing with poverty, the child is in the world, And actually, if you think about it, most of fiction about young people in the 19th century is fairly grounded in reality. It's not a lot of fantasy yet.
There's not a lot of escapism, I would say.
Yeah, it's mostly.
But see, those authors were not writing for children. They weren't writing. They were writing for, all of them were writing for an adult audience. I mean, I don't even think Louisa May Alcott was writing for children.
No, and I think you're right. And I think Dickens was not writing for children. These people were writing to be published in magazines that came out every week or every month. We're subscribers. We're grown adults. We're just fascinated in the life of children, and children by default could follow along. And by the time you get to the beginning of the 20th century, you see in America the rise of libraries, a much better, broader base for public schools, curriculum and education, a greater degree of literacy, and a real commitment to just having in school a whole section of works just about the experience of youth. And I think really where I think the modern era of young adult fiction really, I think the two most seminal books prior to even myself would be the publication of J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye in the 1950s, and S.C. Hinton's book, The Outsiders, in the late 60s. And Salinger was a writer for The New Yorker. He did write about young people, but I don't really believe he wrote Catcher in the Rye for young people as much as it just happened to be that experience of being a disconnected youth in New York City just spoke to him, and it spoke to adults. It's hard to realize because most of us who read Catcher in the Rye read it when we're very young. I assume, how old were you when you read Catcher in the Rye, Randall?
I didn't read it till I was in my 20s, and I loved it. I believe Catcher in the Rye is a book about, like everything this guy wrote just about longing for the loss of childhood or regretting the loss of childhood. I think that's... and this is a guy who was a really happy kid and regrets that he ever had to grow up.
But what you see in Catcher in the Rye is a certain kind of emotional vulnerability, an emotional reality, a grounding that resonates with, I think, people, because it really feels, it doesn't feel like an adult's idea of a child. Well, Holden Caulfield feels like a real teenager, a real adolescent.
I feel like the character in Catcher in the Rye, Holden, he is he has the maturity of a teenager, and he's butting up against the adult world, and he hates it. And you can see it in every single passage of the book, which is a feeling I think a lot of young people have. I mean, I had it in my 20s, I think. I think a lot of adults even have that.
And I think the great emotional resonance of Catcher in the Rye is that Holden isn't entirely right. He's not entirely wrong. The adults in the book, it's very hard to know their motives. They seem somewhat murky. He is just thrust into a New York City. He's thrust into a world that's not of his own, and he just kind of wanders through it. I don't really feel there's a giant... I know, my apologies to people who are teachers here, I don't really feel there's a great moral lesson to be learned in A Catcher in the Rye. Or if there is, you can enjoy this story just as a story about someone who goes out of their world, gets thrust into an environment, tries to figure out how to make it work, and never really fully comes together as a person, because human beings never really have these great cathartic
changes. He just comes to discover it's a cold, unfeeling world.
Well,
it hates him.
it's a break if you're reading childhood fiction where there was traditionally the lesson learned. Because when you're reading, not for pleasure, but you're reading in school, and as a kid, there were so many. I read Johnny Tremain, and Johnny Tremain, he was a colonial young child. And what's the one about the kid who chops the trees down?
I can't remember that.
But you know what I'm saying? I mean, your earliest introduction when you're in elementary school are these very moralistic tales of right and wrong and responsibility.
Yeah,
and there's nothing responsible about Holden Caulfield.
I guess there's a there's a certain strain of books aimed at kids that are supposed to teach kids about things, morality, life,
the good
something.
Things, yes.
Usually morality.
And that's none of it and not just in the Franny and Zoe stories. And these kids are endowed with an intelligence that's, you might think is the intelligence of an adult, but certainly they have an intelligence that you don't normally up until that point see in children. They're complicated thinkers and they have complex feelings. And then,
and I want to say about The Outsiders, The Outsiders.
S.E. Hinton, 1967. Go ahead.
I feel The Outsiders is really the epitome, the start of a trend in YA that is what YA is known for. And this is my opinion, is that it's escapist. I think that
really, because I think it starts a trend.
I know, because I know what you're going to say. You're saying, there's a social realism. I think that's wrong.
100% familiar with The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. I think it's easier for me to just assume you've all read Catcher. But S.E. Hinton was a teenager in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who wrote a book at the age of 16 about high school gangs in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the rich kids and the greasers who were the poor kids. And it's told from the perspective of one of the greasers. And it is about class. It is about fighting. It's about identity. It's about friendships, about belonging. And it takes place in what would have been a contemporary world in the time that it was written.
I know everybody in the world will disagree with me, but I think The Outsiders is about a fantasy world, and it's completely unrealistic, and it's escapism.
Okay, well, it's certainly not a high concept story. There's nothing in The Outsiders where, it's a dystopian future. There's no magic. There's no robots. Everything that happens in The Outsiders has happened in that period of history and could easily happen again today. You still have gangs, you still have class.
I'll put another book in that genre. Go Ask Alice. Okay. Now,
all right. Well, that's fine. But
Go Ask Alice.
So Go Ask Alice
escapist as well. I feel. I mean,
hold on.
I think when kids read that book, I did.
Well, let's
when
stop
kids read
for
that
a second
book,
to explain that book, Randall. So a few years later, there's a wonderful book about teenage drug use called Go Ask Alice. It came out in 1971, and before you get super contrarian, maybe you could just give me the moment to add the context for which you're going to rebel against.
I'm not rebelling. I'm just speaking the truth.
You're being iconoclast, which is fine. But you can't rally against an iconoclast.
I haven't done a survey to see what everybody thinks.
You're rebelling against something without letting people establish what it is you're rebelling. You can't be a rebel until you have an establishment to fight. Let me be the establishment here and say that what you start to see in the early 70s, when I am in school and you're not even alive yet, is a lot of stories about what it's like to be a teenager or an adolescent in the real world. You have people like Judy Blume who are starting to write. And what I'm seeing in school and the stuff that we're reading is all about, it's mostly, a lot of it is cautionary tales. And I remember we had this magazine, you probably had it too, called Scholastic.
Yes.
And they would publish excerpts or condensed versions of these YA stories. And then like the next week, we had this thing called the After School Special, which were adaptations, including Go Ask Alice. I remember seeing the adaptation, and you'd come home around 4:00, and there was this 90-minute movie that was normally an adaptation on one of these books. Often it was about drug use, alcoholism, runaways, big issue with runaways. I remember a million stuff like that. And as somebody who was not yet, I ended that decade at the age of 15. So definitely someone who was coming into adolescence. What most of the YA entertainment was, not the stuff so much that I was reading as much as what I was watching on TV and what I was learning in school were about the difficulties of being a kid, the dangers of being out in the world. We were free range kids, and a lot of these things were really going on: drug use, kidnapping. Nothing that we were seeing at that time, I hate to say it, nothing that we saw at that time did not exist already. I knew kids who were doing drugs. I knew kids who would run away, and I knew kids who would drink.
I just want to say something. I want to make an aesthetic point. I believe that most quote unquote cautionary tales, okay, what not to do, are really just excuses for prurience.
Well, be that as it may, at that time,
and that's the case of Go Ask Alice, I believe.
All right. Well, YA novels in that period, and historically in that period, coming up had been mostly cautionary tales, because in that period of social unrest coming out of the 60s, there was a great fear that my generation, the cuspers, the people who were born in between the baby boom and the beginning of Gen X, that we were going to go down that same path.
Well, let me say something about that.
There was a lot of crime in the street. There was a lot of danger. It was not a safe suburban 1980s environment, which we'll get to in a moment when we get to your childhood.
Well, let me just say something about that. Okay, I forgot what I was going to say. Go on.
Okay, good. Because I just want to motor through just a little bit more and say that my earliest experiences in the 70s of reading about young people before I was an adolescent was Johnny Tremain. Did you read Johnny Tremain?
Yes, I think we did in a class.
Right. It's a very dry story about this kid who was a child in colonial history. And I could not really relate. I don't know if it was because at the time I had no interest in history or it was a very dry book.
Johnny Tremain, I don't know what it's like today, but Johnny Tremain was really pushed on kids.
Yeah, it was.
I mean, I don't know why. I guess it was like patriotic, and Tremain was supposed to be a moral example for kids. I don't know.
But I could not relate. I had no, this kid I knew as a 7-year-old just did not exist. That was a grown-up's idea of a kid.
There was a generation that loved Johnny Tremain.
Oh, my mom was so disappointed in me for not enjoying that book because she had loved it as a child. And I think to this day it still upsets her. My mom was, by the way, an elementary school teacher for a long time and had a very strong influence on probably my reading as much as your mom.
My mother was a high school librarian, now retired.
Yes. So we both, full disclosure, I think our moms have played an influence on us in this dimension. But I was going to say, prior to reading YA novels, my favorite stuff was the Great Brain series and Encyclopedia Brown.
Yeah, Encyclopedia Brown, yeah.
And Detective Agency, right? And in that sense, I thought, well, the Great Brain was cool because he used his brain to solve stuff. And Encyclopedia Brown, which is a variation on the Great Brain, I mean, he had his own detective agency, but the kind of crimes that he solved were the kind of crimes that would only exist in the world he lived in.
Why doesn't Netflix make those?
I don't know, because they were amazing and they were kept at a very kid level, right? I mean, Encyclopedia Brown,
the cases were like
heroin traffickers,
He would solve like the case of the missing baseball and stuff like that, right? I mean, it was
things that could theoretically happen in your universe, but it was still high concept enough because it was, a power kid. And
it was escapist.
And I was, when I was in school, the kind of adolescents I could relate to were like the Teen Titans. They were in comic books. So there was a Teen Titans, and they were teenagers, and they were the sidekicks of the grown-up superheroes, or the New Mutants, which were the young X-Men, who were the sidekicks of the X-Men heroes, essentially. But were into superpowers and the future. And I think by the time I was 13, for fun, I just stopped reading anything that had anything to do with about a young person. And I was fully thrown into the world of adults. And I got into Stephen King in a big way. Strangely enough, through watching Carrie, which is probably one of the best YA horror movies that was never called a YA horror movie. And then pretty quickly he wrote Firestarter, which is also about a 13-year-old with great telekinetic powers. And he does write teenagers really well. And we'll get to that maybe in a little while in this discussion, but I just didn't care about it. And then by that point, when I'm after middle school, when I get to high school, I'm in all these AP English classes, and we read standard canon books. So almost the very last thing I remember even experiencing as a teenager that was YA-ish wasn't even a book. It was the 1980 movie Fame. When I was 14, the kids were 14. They were from New York City. I was from New York City. It dealt with heavy issues like sexual identity, depression, suicide, pornography, trying to become a professional actor, living your dreams. I mean, there's singing and dancing, but you've seen Fame?
No, I have not. I've never seen any Fames. And
No, not the TV series, the movie.
Yeah, neither of them. Nothing.
Watch it if you can get a copy of it. I strongly recommend it.
Well, I want to. Since you're bringing
it's very gritty and social realism.
Okay, since you're bringing it up, I want to say something about God, what is the word? Yeah, you're talking about cautionary tales. So the reason why cautionary tales, the reason why you have to, if you have a prurient storyline, you have to couch it as a cautionary tale, because otherwise it wouldn't get made. It wouldn't get published. Okay, because no publisher is going to go out and say, oh, here's a hedonistic fantasy about drugs and sex and partying, and there's no consequences. Everybody just has a good time. The end.
Well,
people might like it, but no publisher, nobody's going to make it because everybody will get crap for it. Okay, so when you contextualize it,
was banned because it wasn't enough of a
because there's not enough of exactly. This is my point. There's not enough. The Outsiders is a fantasy story about drugs and partying and doing stuff that's fun,
but no, it was banned because it wasn't a strong enough cautionary tale. Same with Catcher in the Rye.
That's my point.
What did you read, Randall, when you were a child? What was your introduction
to what? Cautionary tales?
No, to young adult fiction.
I read a lot of the classic stuff. I read Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, which was the sequel. They were fun. I read a lot of Mark Twain. I read Treasure Island. Treasure Island's a great book, by the way. I don't know if you ever read it.
Robert Louis Stevenson, one of my favorite poets. Let's talk about Treasure Island for a moment, because I think there's a lot of things in Treasure Island that you see in a lot of contemporary YA fiction. I mean, the protagonist is thrust into a very dangerous world, and it is very unforgiving.
Yeah. I mean, well, again, should I talk about? Talk about
Treasure Island for a little bit. You've got something to say.
Well, I'm just thinking now of my my theory about an aesthetic theory of young adult novels, right?
Well, you might want to hold off on that because I haven't heard anything yet about your actual experience reading them. So before you opine, if you could at least share, what was it like for you as a child and then as an adolescent? What did you read that had dealt with people your own age at that time, both for fun and in school?
Well, my mother used to go to librarian conferences and bring back books that were almost nearly unknown, that authors were trying to sell or just written. And those books, I read some of those and they were interesting. I mean, I remember there was this one book about two high school boys who were going to go on a road trip to in the summer to every one of the 50 states. And so they loaded up the trunk of the car full of condoms because they were going to use so many condoms. And of course, they never used one condom, But
I mean, you bring up a really good point, which is, I mean, we talked about it in another 3-part episode, but I mean, sex stories from people our own age, especially for me in film, and that took up a lot of my, this is what I want to know about being a teenager.
Well, there's an interesting
part.
There's an interesting director, Catherine Breillat. She did this. I can't remember the name of the movie. 36 Fillet.
Yeah,
it's about a teenage girl trying to lose her virginity. I mean, this is very French, and she's making it for an adult audience, though. And
it came out about 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's a great. I mean, Catherine Breillat is like so great. But it's interesting because this is totally for an adult audience. So there are books written for teenage girls about losing your virginity, and I'm trying to think of a story now. I know they're out there.
Well, they were even out there in the 70s, but they were
Go mature. Ask Alice. It happens.
They were mature and nuanced approaches And I have to admit, I wasn't that concerned about mature or nuanced approaches to sex when I was a 14-year-old boy watching stories about 14-year-old boys trying to lose their virginity. There was no interest in a nuanced approach at all.
It's weird reading a book about.
Actually, you just reminded me of something, and I apologize for doing this because it's rude. But in 1982, when the movie Fast Times at Ridgemont came out, Ridgemont High, I was able to get a copy of the book, and it's I guess it's fiction in that they changed the names, but it's not fiction in that it's based on actual experiences. But Cameron Crowe, who graduated high school, I think at 15 or something, he was a reporter for the Rolling Stones, so he graduated fairly early. When he was 17, he went into a high school in Southern California, and he spent a year as a student. And he writes this book based on his experiences. And I remember reading that, and that was really awesome. I mean, that was probably the very last time until I read Lesson Zero, which is more about college students and is post YA, that I go, man, this is what it's like to be a teenager today. This kind of experience, even though there was nothing in Fast Times at Ridgemont High that had anything to do with my own high school experience, the emotional realities and the obstacles and the way they felt and saw things and their relationships to their teachers and adults and to their friends and to their enemies and their hopes and their dreams. Oh man, that seemed, even their taste in music, like I got where they were coming from in a way that even in the film you don't see. It's a really, I mean, 40 years later, I can still remember what I read in that book.
I just want to say, I am always struck by whenever you read works from all sorts of different time periods, I'm always struck by how many similarities there are rather than differences. Like what you just said about how it Fast Times like just really captured your time period. I mean, I always feel like people really think there's a lot of differences between time periods, and I just don't see it.
Yeah, there is a universality. I think there is a universality. There's a universality in the experience of adolescence that is not true for other things. I think because when you're in adolescence, there's so many things that you're experiencing for the first time. You're dealing with love, sex, identity, school. There's certain universals to that experience that will never change, no matter what decade or century you're living in. And the only thing that really changes maybe is the level of honesty in which the author is allowed or can deal with it, or where the emphasis is. You know, I mean, true, most of the stories I fell in love with were about middle-class Caucasian men like myself, or middle-class Caucasian women who came from places I could relate to. So I know there's going to be more diversity as we move forward in time. I will say though, and did you fall in love with any book or anything that dealt with being a kid when you were a kid? Was there any book as a teenager or an adolescent that you go, man, that's it for me? Like, where that level of identification just locked?
Well, I mean, I've talked about this on other shows, but I didn't read it as a teenager, but Catcher in the Rye, the Holden Caulfield character, that experience of like, quote unquote, identifying with the character and feeling some kind of simpatico with the character. That's an experience I never really felt reading anything until I read Catcher in the Rye.
Did you read like any?
And it's probably because I'm crazy, because that's what crazy people do, right?
I think you told me like you read the Piers Anthony's Ants Theories and you read Dune.
Oh, Piers Anthony is wonderful. Yes, I mean, Piers Anthony's books are like a fun read. I don't think he writes them for kids though, but
in Xanth, right? Isn't the character fairly young?
Yes, but he did intentionally write some young adult novels.
Right. So, but in Xanth, did you read the young adult novels?
Yes, I read one of his young adult novels. It was about a woman. I mean, Anthony, I think he's intentionally trying to write. He's intentionally trying to capture that young adult female audience. You know, this is the huge audience. You know, and it was a book about a girl. She was in high school. You know, she was a cutter. This was a pretty good book. She was a cutter. She I think she finds like an alternate universe, a dimensional gateway in her high school bathroom. And
so he really twines in that book social realism and escapism, which are the two divergent movements in YA fiction.
I liked it.
So,
I liked it a lot.
Were you a teenager or were you an adult?
Yeah, I was young when I read that one. Yeah, that was a fun book.
So, I mean, it is kind of great when there's an author you really like. And that's, I think, how I felt about those Stephen King books, where it's like, oh, man, this is an adult author who can write great adult books. And when it comes time to talk about what it's like to be a teenager, I mean, I read his memoir of like 5 years ago, and his wife was incredibly helpful in helping him write Carrie. And he did work as a janitor in a prep school in Massachusetts for a little while. So he observed firsthand. But yeah, it's a great feeling. And in fact, I would almost say there are two kinds of YA authors. There are YA authors who just write YA for the most part, and I'm not knocking them, but that's just what they do. And then there are authors who we know as adult writers who, like Anthony or King, or who, if they're not writing essentially a YA novel, at least they're telling a story where the protagonist is in that age group. And I got to admit, I love those books so much. And do you think maybe that when we fall in love with these books, when we're children or teenagers, even though we become a more critical reader as an adult, it's kind of like a song that we fell in love with a pop song when we fell in love when we were teenagers. There's always going to be a place in our heart very sentimental towards that.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure. I mean, although I don't know, I think I have picked up some of these older books I read when I was a kid, and they're still amazing. I mean, some of them I realized they were terrible when I was reading them as a kid. I still read them.
Yeah.
I don't know if adults will do that.
There's definitely a bond. I think
there's another book I want to mention. I think it's called The Drifters. It's by James Michener, and it's about, I think it came out in 1971. It's an impossible book to find. I think I even did a Google search on it. I couldn't even find it on Google. I mean, it's about a bunch of hippie kids in the summer of love traveling around the world and having doing hippie stuff. And it's crazy, man. I mean, James Michener, he writes the historical fiction.
Yeah.
He's brought all of his historical fiction skills and his graduate student skills to bear on this book about hippies doing drugs and partying. And it's an amazing book. It's not young adult. I mean, maybe kids shouldn't be reading this book. There's some stuff in it.
You read that as a kid?
I read that in high school. I think it was on my grandfather's bookshelf. I don't think he ever read it.
I think that was the thing for me in high school, is that by the time I got to high school, neither my teachers nor myself were really concerned about the world of children, because the point of high school was to prepare us for the adult world. And I loved that, because all I wanted to do was read about grown-ups so I could be an adult as quickly as possible. By the time I'm reading about children in college, and I'm thinking now of Great Expectations or David Copperfield, I don't know why my mind goes to Dickens, but it just does. The childhood storylines are always part of the development of the main character's progress into maturity and adulthood. And that's when you start using words like coming of age. Coming of age just becomes this, and I think maybe in fairness, almost all YA novels are coming of age.
Well, coming of age.
You start viewing everything about the childhood experience. Ooh, I just kind of disappeared there for a second. You view everything at that point in your 20s as, well, everything that I did up until this point made me the adult I am today. Because 18 to 22, clearly I'm an adult. That's it. End of story.
Well, coming of age, I think, tends to be the first time you do stuff. The first time you have sex, the first time you have a boyfriend, girlfriend, the first time you do whatever. And, I think in that respect,
it's a loss of innocence, because once you gain this new knowledge, you cannot go back to Eden. Right.
And I think in that respect, that's why Catcher in the Rye, I don't think he does much first anything. Catcher in the Rye.
No, he does. It is. He goes out, he runs away into the city on his own. That is a first.
Yeah, that's true.
And I mean, what he learns about adults and himself at the end, that is his art, in my opinion.
Yes.
There's a million people are going, no, that's not the way a teacher will read it.
Yes.
Fine, you get your own show.
Yes. But yeah, I mean, it's like, but it's not like, it's not, I mean, you couldn't say it's a traditional coming of age story or anything like that. I mean, now, there's certain milestones that you think of when a person becomes an adult, and losing their virginity is one of them, obviously, but there's others.
No, and there's a really good movie I did see as a kid called The Summer of 42, which is about a teenage boy in the summer of 42 who loses virginity to an older woman played by Catherine Ross. I don't remember the kid. And it was very nuanced and tasteful. And it's a really good coming of age film. It reads almost like a short story. It has a very literary feel to it because of its subtlety and its nuance and its ability to not shy away from the harder questions of the film. It's not a sex comedy at all. So let's move forward into our own adulthood. And I will tell you that I was working in a bookstore. I started working in bookstores in the 90s. And I remember around the mid 90s, late 90s, when the Goosebumps by R.L. Stine became very popular. And when I was working in a bookstore, all of a sudden the children's section started like getting bigger and bigger, and the age divisions started being very specific. And then all of a sudden we had genre divisions. And I would say, I don't think I was there for Harry Potter. I think it was out of selling books by the time Harry Potter came out in 99. But there was so many books about, series, and there was stuff about magic and horrors and ghosts. And I completely forgot to mention one of the big popular books of my youth, which was the V.C. Andrews' Flowers in the Attic. I think sometime, probably even before my time, but definitely.
My girlfriend loves those, yeah.
In the 80s, teenagers could not get enough of horror teen books in the way that traditionally they couldn't get away from horror teen movies. And when I saw like R.L. Stine, I thought, oh, that's kind of like Flowers in the Attic for the preteens, like Animorphs and all that
I have a theory about that. You want to hear it?
Please.
I think the young kids are into horror because of puberty, because their bodies are changing. And so a lot of horror is concerned with the body.
Yeah.
It's like it's obsessed with the body. And these kids at that age, their bodies are changing. They're obsessed with their own body.
And kids always feel like monsters to begin with. So I think kids always feel like they're the monster. They're the ones who are awkward, who are constantly changing. They're getting taller. Their voices are changing. They're getting bigger. They're always hulking out or morphing into something. And then there's always there's a lot of fear and power issues. And that's interesting too, because by the time, and I really think that the game changer has to be a Harry Potter, because when you get to that Harry Potter phenomena in the beginning of the 21st century, when all of a sudden you have a YA novel that's being read, not just by children, but by adults, it's a bestseller. All kids are reading Harry Potter, not just in school, but for fun. I mean, I don't know if you guys do remember, I'm sure. I don't know what time you're watching this in history, but when those books came out, these kids would just walk around with a book in their hand, just reading, because we didn't have iPhones yet. That was literally the last time, I think, in America that I saw a child deliberately put their head in a book for fun.
Yeah, the Harry Potter phenomenon was crazy. I mean, people were camping out at night to be in line for the release in the morning of the next Harry Potter book. I mean, it was a phenomena.
It was, and like adults, I would know. My mom like, "Have you read the Harry Potter books? You want to read?" Like, no, it's okay. But in fact, it's interesting because the first book is what's the Saucer. I can't remember these titles.
Well,
but the first one comes out in '99, and I become an English teacher in middle school in South Central in 2001. So I think by that point, there's at least 2, maybe 3 Harry Potter books out in the world at this point. I remember distinctly, I'm a new teacher. I'm teaching English. I'm very self-conscious because I went to private school, and here I'm teaching in an economically disadvantaged area. I'm dealing with a lot of kids who grew up poor, from not using the PC term. They grew up in poor urban environments, very different from my own. And, you have all these books, and they were written, either I'm teaching them books that are just specifically about their world and not mine, or I have these books that are moral stories or cautionary tales or stories about animals. And I was shocked to find out that they had all read the first Harry Potter book in 6th grade. And then we have a movie day where we show, I believe, that movie or the second one. And all the kids are really into Harry Potter. And like, wait a second, I can't get these kids to read like an 8-page short story about someone who's exactly like them in the same kind of world And yet they don't mind like staying up all night reading a 400, 600 page book. And I remember thinking, well, if they like Harry Potter, when I was their age, I was a big fan of The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe and the Chronicles of Narnia. And this was before the movie came out. So I'm like, maybe I can teach that. And sure enough, I had found out from some other teachers that I'd borrowed some lesson plans. Said, yeah, they had. And they would react. I was able to use Harry Potter to get them into the world of Lewis Carroll. Not Lewis Carroll, sorry. C.S. Lewis. And, there's a lot of similarities between Harry Potter and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as far as they're English, they're roughly in the same age group, they're dealing with the world of magic and animals. But the concepts that Lewis is dealing with philosophically are far more complicated than what Rawlings was. And while I couldn't teach these kids at high school level or even a college level, I was at least able to use Harry Potter as a jumping point for something that was, I felt, more complicated and equally interesting. And I will always be grateful to have been a teacher during the rise of Harry Potter.
Yeah, you witnessed the phenomenon. I was working in a retail video game store during the rise of Pokemon, and I got to witness that.
Anyway, just the same thing.
Anyway, now I want to bring up. Now I think it's a good time to bring up my aesthetic.
Yeah, because I think that once we get past Harry Potter, we quickly start to see all of these other books come in, like the Twilight series and Hunger Games, and in the last 20 years, it's exploded. And now there's everything under the sun.
Right. Well,
after your theory.
Yeah, YA is like a very popular genre right now. Maybe half the readers are adults, probably more. My girlfriend, she runs a young adult book club. They all adults. I mean, they love it. I think aesthetically speaking, the young adult genre is, everybody always has problems trying to define the genre. But I think definitely one thing that aesthetically the genre has in common, some similarities all the works have, is that they're all escapist. I think Harry Potter is extremely escapist. They don't have anything to do with the real world. I think it's the difference between, like, say, a work like Star Wars versus Dune, and
I really take issue with that. I'm going to stop you right there and say, I think there's two different strains in YA fiction. There's escapism, which we're more familiar because they're the easier films to adapt. And then there's social realism like Speak, which is about acquaintance rape, or The Perks of Being a Wallflower, which is about isolation and feeling. So no, I'm not gonna go there with you. I'm gonna say just the opposite. I think you still see a lot of really good, it could be good or bad, but a lot of focus also on social realism and issues of the day in YA fiction. You see escapism. I think the escapism adapts a lot better to the big film. But remember, a few years ago was the movie. It was a very strange title, but it was about a girl who was abused. It was nominated for an Academy Award. It had an abusive mother. I'm totally blanking. Yeah, but that was the author's name was Sapphire. I'm terrible about it, but my point is that was a YA novel, and it was very heavy, and it did very well. But I do think you can say that there's more attention given to the Hunger Games and to Twilight, but you cannot disregard all the work that's being done still coming out of the whole S.C. Hinton, J.D. Salinger approach to telling real stories about the difficulty of being a contemporary teenager.
Well, again, I do think S.E. Hinton is completely escapist, and I think the social realism works, or the social commentary works, are few and far between in the YA. In fact, I think that aesthetically speaking, the YA genre is almost, that's what the audience expects of it, is escapism. I think that's why the genre has become so popular and why so many adults like it, because you pick up a...
Well, are you just saying that adults are the ones? Because remember...
Let me finish my sentence.
YA novel is also read by kids. If you're just I'll even grant you this point, which is if you're saying that the only kind of YA stuff adults are reading is the escapist stuff, and the kids are more focused on the stuff that's not escapist, maybe there's some credence to that.
All right, let me finish my thought here.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that when somebody picks up a YA book, they are expecting escapism. I think that's why the genre is so popular. And
doesn't it depend on what the book's about? I mean, if you read a book and this is
it's about
coming out of the
escapism,
closet, or it's about choosing a gender identity, that's not escapism. If this is about living in a house of drug addiction, it
depends on the book. It depends. Okay,
well, but people tend to read what books are about before they read books, man.
Yeah, and like Harry, the best-selling, most popular books in the genre are pure escapism. Hunger Games, Harry Potter.
Certainly, those are the ones.
Sweet Valley High. I remember my sister
they've been the most commercially successful. I would agree.
Exactly.
Yeah, Sweet Valley High. Whatever happened to that in Babysitter?
I know. Well, Sweet Valley High, Babysitter's Club. Oh my gosh, those were huge series of books. My sister read all those. She loved those books, and I tried to read them. They're just pure escapism, man. I mean, this is why in high school I quickly transitioned to adult books, because see, I think this is what happens is, like, when you're an adult and you want escapism, you pick up any kind of adult book. Serious, quote unquote, serious authors. They want to put something in the book that relates to the real world. They don't want to write pure fluff, pure escapism. So every time you pick up an adult book, fiction included, there's gonna be something in there that is, I don't know, social commentary or depressing or truth, something that brings you down, that most people don't care about.
Well, I think
why YA is safe for everybody.
Well, but I think you're talking about something that's interesting and unique to YA, which is, why is YA written? Because YA is written in a way that I would argue general fiction is not, which is, if you're an author of YA fiction, and I'm not one, so I'm now on dangerous ground, you have the capacity to write something that can be taught in a school. Whereas normally, if you're a novelist and you're just writing a novel, you're not really thinking about, oh yeah, can I have this taught in a school? Your livelihood is dependent on how many schools order your books.
Yeah, there's definitely a market thing.
So that's a very important thing. You really do have to think about this as, is this the kind of thing that can be taught? Or you come from the opposite perspective as a YA novel and say, is this the kind of thing that today's teenager, today's pre-teenager is going to resonate with? Am I going to be able to do that? I mean, Josh Green is fascinating. He writes The Fault in Our Stars because he does so much online work that he cultivates a direct relationship with his own fan base. So he doesn't even really worry about the schools, nor does he have to imagine what stuff is like. He has an ongoing conversation in the same way that a lot of grown-up writers do with their own fans.
Well, that's an interesting point you bring up, the education market, because my mother was a school librarian, so I know that market very well. I understand that market. Maybe the only reason, maybe one of the only reasons there are non-escapist YA books is to cater to that market. I mean, maybe if there was no education market, there wouldn't be non-escapist YA books.
Well,
maybe the YA genre should just be called the escapist genre.
Because I see kids reading books today that are still in social realism. There are always going to be kids who want to see their worlds reflected in art, and they want to have that direct communication. That speaks to kids who read for fun versus kids who are reading because that's what their teacher is telling them to read. It's just a unique genre. It's a unique beast. It's not even a genre, I would argue, because technically every genre of fiction can be written in YA style. And I think at this point in history, just about every genre of fiction has been written in YA style. It's just, are you writing your YA for entertainment? Are you writing it for some level of moral or intellectual edification? And then I don't really ever think, and tell me if I'm wrong, please, I don't think any YA writer really is writing for grown-ups. I think there are grown-ups who write about the child experience for children, but I think when a YA writer is writing, they're either writing for children for fun or they're writing for teaching, but they're not. I think the adult who reads the YA novel has to accept they're not the primary intended market.
Maybe that makes them even more appealing to certain adults. I mean, if you're thinking you're not going to use big words. You're going to use simple sentences. You're going to make it less complicated. I mean, there's a certain reader that doesn't want to work really hard when they're reading a book. It's like,
I mean, I don't think it's a lazy.
I don't know for fun. They don't want to
They may not be a lazy reader. They just might really want to know.
Well, I'm not faulting
what it's like to be a child today. Sorry,
I'm not faulting them. They just want to kick back and relax. They don't want to read Infinite Jest.
or maybe they just. It's possible they have children of their own and they want to know what it's like, or they teach, or they want to know what it's like to be a child today. Or maybe it's also possible that you get to a point as an adult where you want to go, what was it like to live in a universe where I had all the existential answers, right? I mean, one of the great things about being a grown-up today is even the great mysteries of our youth are not entirely mysteries anymore. Whereas when you're reading contemporary adult fiction, you're dealing with heavy-duty stuff that you can't really resolve because you're still in it. It's much harder as a middle-aged man to read a middle-aged story and feel that sign of godlike omniscience that I kind of am smarter than my protagonist, or I have answers that the author will not provide, because you're in the middle of your own life. But when you read about childhood, you are really reading about an area of your life that you have it's like a book where you know how it ends, just like the book itself. Childhood ends, and because it ends, there's a feeling like you're going back to something that you can completely contain, even if you can't. Does that make sense?
That's a very interesting point. And
I did my best.
Maybe we should.
No. That's my final sentence. I that's the best I can say about that. Is that let me just say it again because I think there was an audio issue. So my alarm went off. That's why I'm saying this. I think one of the reasons why adults do maybe like to read it is because childhood is a defined period of their life that is over. So all the heavy-duty existential questions have already been answered. You now have this lovely helicopter view when you look at childhood where you can feel closure and continuity. But if you're reading a book today about what it's like to be an adult today, and you're an adult today, there's going to be a certain ambiguity at the end of the story that you cannot rectify. Maybe the author knows something you don't. Maybe even the author doesn't know. But you don't leave in contemporary fiction often feeling that lovely sense of moral absolute or intellectual absolute knowledge that you can get when you're reading about a book from the vantage point of being an adult. And I think there's an appeal for that level of control in a very uncontrolled period of your own life. Or maybe, and this is my other theory, for me, is that middle age feels like a second adolescence. And the last time I felt like my body was going through changes and I felt awkward and maladjusted and like I didn't fit in was when I was a teenager. So maybe there's almost like a parallelism that you're trying to explore by rereading these books about you, young people. Or maybe it keeps you feeling connected to young people because as you get older, you do feel increasingly disconnected because young people look at you and go, hey, old man. So that's my counter theory to your theory.
All right. Well, let's end the show.
Well, do you have any final thoughts?
That was better than any one of my final thoughts, probably. So let's go with your final
then I'll
thought.
Just say, I know a number of you out there who are friends of mine. You guys read YA novels. You guys teach YA novels. Some of you write YA novels. Please, if there's ever been an episode where I really want you to honestly share your thoughts and feelings with us, it's this one. Because this is not one where I feel like I'm an expert. Do you feel like you're an expert, Randall, in this one?
No.
Right. So maybe we're just talking out of the sides of our ass, or maybe you think what we're saying is true. But your response really will guide where we go with this topic in the future. So thank you for listening to us on this. I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
And thank you for being part of our show.
Bye.
Goodbye.